Now we move on to the Baroque opera. Some of you know something about opera, and usually that something is that you don't like it. Well, let's take a listen to the first operas and see whether we can change some of your minds. I hope we can, because opera may seem a little overwhelming and it may seem old-fashioned. May seem like only old fuddy-duddy people go to operas, but in reality, opera is some of the most gorgeous music ever created. Sometimes it's a little too long. Sure, it can last up to 3 or 4 hours, but opera in itself has beautiful pieces of music that are used still today, performed in many different ways, and we all know and love some parts of operas even if we don't know it. The specific Baroque operas we're going to be looking at are the music of Claudio Monteverdi and Henry Purcell. In order to understand their music in Baroque opera, we're going to look at the development of opera as a Baroque form in order to know where it came from and why it came into being. We're going to look at the different characteristics of opera when it was first made, and then we're going to look at the life and the operas of Monteverdi and Purcell. So what is music that is opera? Opera was a new musical form developed in the Baroque era by very bored, very rich men. Remember in the Renaissance, they had people starting to look into new philosophies and new ideas on what it was to be human. And most of those studies were pursued by rich people who had nothing else to do because all of the work was done by their serfs and peasants or the common man who was poor. So another thing that they pursued was new music. As we know, we've talked about many new music forms that have developed because of the aristocracy, and this is yet one more. So what exactly is that opera? An opera is a drama that is sung to orchestral accompaniment. In other words, it's taking music, acting, poetry, dance, scenery, and costumes, and putting them all together into a theatrical experience that excites audiences. There is no spoken dialogue. So if any of you have seen a Broadway musical, that's almost an opera, but there is sung music in it and there is spoken dialogue. There's no spoken dialogue in an opera. Everything is sung. So they created music forms in opera that would represent spoken dialogue through song and then would also have regular songs. The story itself is developed through the acting and through the songs. So, since there's music, you can have very unlikely plots because music can make all things possible. It's possible to take a very far-fetched story that no one would believe, very fantastical stories, and create something amazing out of it with music. So remember, with an opera, the music is the drama, and that drama is always sung, and there's always an orchestra underneath it to support it. Opera demands great performers that can both sing and act, and that was not necessarily common in the Baroque era. They didn't have people who were used to being in front of cameras or anything like that, so they had to train a new generation of musicians to be able to sing and act at the same time. And it was very complicated to produce operas because there were so many performers, there were directors for the different aspects of the show, there were extras to be on stage, there were crew members, there were lighting people, there were orchestra members, and then of course they had the music director, the composer, and the librettist. So many people were involved in these productions. That's why the aristocracy at first controlled power over them, because they're the only ones who had money to produce the shows. The large number of performers used to create these operas really made them very exciting. They became a spectacle that would bring in audiences across Europe. When it was first introduced in Italy, people would travel to see it. It's really one of the first things tourists went to see besides landscapes. And of course, as I've said, opera was originally associated with kings, courts, and the aristocracy. It did eventually become a popular form, surprisingly enough, and everyone loved it. It became so popular, it was like normal popular music nowadays. Everyone would go to hear the opera. So what are the things necessary for an opera to be an opera? Well, you must have a composer and a librettist. It must have some sort of fantastical story to it, not necessarily realistic. In this case, or during the Baroque period, they would use Greek mythology for their stories. The music itself helps to create the characters and gives an idea of mood and emotion. Opera can be comic or serious. It can be up to 3 hours in length. They use songs, also called arias, and recitatives, a way of putting speech into music. We'll talk more about that later. They can be anywhere from 1 to 5 acts, and they're full of many different pieces of music. There's always a chorus that creates atmosphere, there are soloists that sing the big parts, and there's an orchestra that accompanies all the music. So a composer and a librettist are the two people who create an opera together. In the case of opera, you have to have someone who can write the music and someone who can write the words to that music. The libretto is the script that's developed, that's the text of an opera, and it's written by a librettist. The composer, of course, is the one who writes the music that goes with that libretto. When you have a combination of two minds that really fit together well, they're able to create really great opera because they really fit the words and the music together. Operas that don't have a good combination for a librettist and composer are the ones that fail and that usually close within a week or two of opening. Truly great opera has to have a great composer and a great librettist. As I said, we go more into detail about the aria and the recitative. So these are your big vocab words when it comes to opera. An aria is a song for solo voice with orchestral accompaniment. In other words, it's any song in an opera that's melodic and beautiful, that's for a solo vocalist, that has the orchestra playing underneath. These arias really show off the range of the singers, and they usually describe a feeling or they meditate on something that's happening in the plot of an opera. The most common form of an aria, a specific form, is the da capo aria. Da capo literally means back to the beginning. So in this case, it's a song in ternary form within an opera, an ABA form, which we learned about earlier in the semester. So the first melodies are in the A section, you have new melodic material in the B section, and then you return to the to the old melodic material in the A section. So again, it's got this sense of unification because it uses the same melodies over and over again, and it repeats enough that the soloist who's singing the part is able to recreate the music in new varied ways to create excitement for the audiences. Usually before an aria there's a section of music called a recitative. This is a little harder to understand. Not only does it lead into an aria, but it sets up a storyline. It's when the narrator or the character is doing a monologue or a dialogue. And so it needs to sound as close to speech as possible. So a recitative is just like the recitation of poetry. It's something that is like speech, but it's done with pitch, tone color, and rhythm so that it sounds like music as well. So if I were to continue speaking in this manner, I'd simply be speaking. But if I was going to do recitative, it would sound something like this. Hello, welcome to the music class, and thank you for paying attention today. So I'd be talking, but that talking would be done in a musical line. It's not a melody. It's not like an aria that is a song, but it's something that can help establish what's happening in the opera, and it's used to connect one melodic section to another. So a lot of the time you'll have a recitative and then an aria, then another recitative, and then perhaps a chorus movement, then more recitative. This is so that the opera can be entirely sung. Now there are two types of recitative, and I'll just go briefly into that. If you want to know more about it, please read your book about these two. Secco recitative and accompanied recitative are the two types of recitative used and are still the two types most common today in operas. Secco means dry, and what that literally means is during a recitative, the only sounds you hear are the solo singer and an occasional chord in the basso continuo. The chord is not held very long, it's simply dry and quick. It's just there enough to support the singer if that singer wants to change a pitch and doesn't know where to go. Accompanied recitative, on the other hand, is a full orchestral accompaniment or a full basso continuo accompaniment. So there's always music going on underneath that supports the recitative harmonically. That's the only difference, is that one of them has held music underneath and the other does not. So now that you know a little bit more about opera, where did opera actually come from? Why did this develop in the Baroque period, and why do we still listen to operas today even if we don't know it? Because if you think about it, Broadway musicals, TV pop shows like Glee, or any of the shows that have music involving in them, Les Miserables, the new movie that came out based off of Andrew Lloyd Webber's Broadway musical, those are all from the opera tradition. They're changed because they're new and popular, but this is where they came from. So where did opera come from? Opera came from, as I said, a group of bored men who wanted something new to listen to. That group was called the Camerata. It was a group of rich, old Italian men who were very inspired by Greek society and Greek tragedy, which was a form of drama created in their society. It's entirely tragic. In other words, all the stories were about something sad, death, a terrible thing happening. So, all opera, when it was first made, was based off of tragedy. Usually, tragic stories from Greek mythology about the gods relating to humans and bad things happening because of that. The original Greek tragedies were sung in kind of a style that was halfway between speech and song, hence the development of the recitative we just talked about. Early opera was also very homophonic, and it was almost entirely composed at first for these court ceremonies and for the aristocracy to enjoy. These old, rich men needed something to entice the rest of the aristocracy to come to their courts and to spend their money in their lands. Opera was the way to do it. 1607 was the first opera, and it was written by Claudio Monteverdi. After that, more and more opera came about. It's beautiful, beautiful music. Opera became popular because in 1637 it was decided that they wanted to build, the rich aristocracy wanted to build, an opera house, or in other words, a concert hall large enough to host the productions of operas. They opened the doors in 1637, and the world changed for opera because they sold tickets at different prices for different areas of the seating. So even the poorest of people, if they saved their money, could come in here and see an opera for the first time. The common man, the poor people, the peasants, they would save for months to come to these productions because they loved the spectacle, they loved the stories, and they loved, in particular, the dramatic singing that they heard. They had never before been able to go into a public concert and see spectacular music performed by the best singers of the age. One of the things that was most popular was a group of singers known as the castrati. Castrati were men who, before the ages of 13 or 14, before puberty had ended for them, they had been castrated, which made it so that they never actually left puberty, which meant that their voices stayed in the soprano range instead of dropping to a tenor or bass range. These men were so famous, they sang all of the female lead roles in operas because it was improper for a woman to be seen on stage. It wasn't common until after the Baroque period to have women singing on stage, and so in their place you had castrati. Of course, the practice was terrible because they couldn't be true human beings after they'd been castrated and put into this role of being a singer, and only a singer. So the practice has died out, and the last castrato actually died around 1860. But before that, they were the most famous singers, and people loved to hear them sing. All of this popularity and the thriving economy that was based off of these opera houses just continued during the Baroque period. So they kept opening more and more opera houses, and they catered to these popular crowds. They lowered ticket prices to get more people to come. And because of that, opera actually spread like wildfire. It became a popular form, so much so that it spread across Europe and eventually into other parts of the world. So let's talk about those great Baroque opera composers, Claudio Monteverdi and Henry Purcell. Monteverdi was born in 1567 and lived until 1643. So he was quite young and only worked in the beginning of the Baroque period. However, his work was monumental. He was born in Italy, and he worked in the courts in Italy. He always felt that he gained little respect as a composer until he moved to Venice later in his life, because it was in Venice that the aristocracy and the opera houses welcomed his operas and his writing, and he could also write for the church. He was best known in his day for his operas and for church motets and madrigals, two other sorts of songs, very much like cantatas. He also had a very large influence on the other composers of his generation and the one after him. People like Bach or Handel, they knew Monteverdi's work and they appreciated his operas greatly, and they learned from his operas so they could create even better examples later in time. All of Monteverdi's music includes voice. All of it. He never wrote a piece that was only instrumental because he absolutely believed that the human voice created emotional intensity in music, and without it, that music was not as good. So, how did his music sound? Because it was only vocal, it was very much a human sound. He really responded to the human voice and to the emotionality of that instrument and really tried to recreate that with dissonance, dynamics, and he also would use new instrumental techniques such as plucking the strings on the stringed instruments because he wanted to help support the vocal melodies he had created. Monteverdi wrote 12 operas, but only 3 survive today, which is a sad thing because it would be amazing to know the other works that were so popular he wrote at the beginning of the Baroque era. He had the capacity to blend music and drama together at a very high level. His was actually the first opera considered to be a great opera. It was written in 1607, right at the beginning of the period, but it was really a beautiful example of Baroque style. The opera was named Orfeo and was based on the Greek myth of Orpheus in the underworld. If you'd like to know more about that story, feel free to look up a synopsis of the opera or the actual Greek myth. It's also described in your text. But I don't want to go through the whole story of the opera now because that's not what's most important. What's most important is to know that Monteverdi wrote gorgeous opera. He wrote it at such a high level that it really epitomizes the Baroque style of opera composition. These were really huge productions, lavish productions that used the best singers. And it was music that was loved by the aristocracy and then later in time loved by the popular culture. Monteverdi used every form of Baroque music available to him in these operas. The movements of the opera were recitatives, arias, duets, ensemble music, chorus, instrumental movements. He used it all in order to create the most effects and to create the most exciting story and spectacle. So let's take a listen to one example of this particular music. If you'd like to listen to a full version of the opera, feel free to do so. It's about 2 hours long in the normal productions from nowadays, and there are several examples of the full production on YouTube that are of good quality. I'd recommend any of the ones that come up in the first 20 examples or so. But what we're going to listen to for the sake of the class is one of the recitatives from the opera. Now this is a very early example of recitative. It's going to sound quite melodic, but the rhythm is quite free, which makes it sound more like speech. And he again uses this concept of Baroque period text painting by bending certain pitches, using dissonance to create the idea of sadness, and he inflects different words that are darker words, sadder words, using lowered pitches. The phrases of music are also irregular so that they represent the darker emotions of this lament. This piece of music is called Tu sei morta. Morta means death, so you can imagine what this piece is about. I'd very much like to strongly recommend that you look at pages 121 to 122 in your text so that you can read along and know what the words actually mean. Know how despairing he is of the loss of his love and his life. And you can also read the synopsis of the opera, as I said, so that you understand where in the opera this part of the story is coming from. The listening guide also helps you to go through the music. So please, pause this lecture, find pages 121 to 122 in your text, and listen along to this beautiful, beautiful example of recitative from the early Baroque period. I hope you enjoyed thinking through and listening to Tu sei morta by Monteverdi. It's a great example of opera. And I want to move on and talk about another great opera composer, Henry Purcell. Purcell lived in the 50 years after Monteverdi. He was a great English composer, the first English composer we talk about. Later on, you'll hear me talk about a German composer who lived in England and was considered one of the greatest of English composers. But he was not native-born, so Purcell really is considered the greatest of native-born English composers. At a very early age, he was singing in the royal court, and he gained employment eventually with the King's Orchestra. After that, he became an organist at Westminster Abbey and then the organist for the royal court. So he was in circles with the most famous and greatest royalty of the century. He was most known for his playing until he decided to delve into writing more music, and he wrote in many different forms, instrumental music and vocal. But he's best known for his one opera from 1687, Dido and Aeneas. It's still today considered the best opera ever to be written in English. It's a shame he died so very young, because we all think, as musical scholars, that he would have created some of the most interesting and exciting new opera trends if only he'd lived a few years longer. His opera from 1687 was Dido and Aeneas. Again, this is a story based off of Greek mythology. So please, if you want to know the story, go and read about it in your text, because again, the text gives a great synopsis of the story itself and the characters Dido and Aeneas. Purcell did an amazing job of using the English language and creating a music that really responded to the inflection and rhythm of the actual language. His beautiful music is really true to the speech patterns of English. It's why it's still considered to be such a great example of English opera. It's also really exciting to listen to much of the time because it has lively rhythms that repeat themselves. It has fresh melodic lines that repeat themselves to create unity of mood. And all of that captures the spirit of English folk music, which wasn't really popular outside of England until much later in time. Of course, as most Baroque composers, he loved homophony and polyphony the most, and so that's what you find the most in his operas. And he used a concept called the ground bass in his operas and in other works. He really helped to make that particular type of form very popular, especially in operas. We'll talk more about it in just a moment. Just a few more things to know about Dido and Aeneas. It's got an interesting history because he was actually writing this opera for a girls' school, a young girls' school. So all of the solo roles are for women. This was the first time in history, in 1687, that a woman was allowed to perform on stage in public. It was only an hour long because, of course, it was written for a school of girls rather than for amazing virtuosic singers. The libretto was by Nahum Tate, and the text that he used was based off the epic poetry of the Roman poet Virgil. This is still a very famous poet today, and if you ever study the Latin language, you'll read Virgil. His stories are really beautiful, and this type of epic poetry was very common in Roman and Greek societies. It was an easy story to use because he wanted to incorporate dance, but no large sets or costumes because, of course, at this girls' school, they didn't have tons of money. So he created a shorter opera that had a very epically fantastical storyline, but it could also incorporate dance and liveliness and beauty. Now that you know a little bit more about the opera, let's talk about the specific technique that you're going to hear. This was a Baroque technique, and it did last beyond the Baroque era, but it was really the most commonly found in this particular era of time. But even today, even if you don't know what it is, we hear it all the time in popular music, especially jazz, blues, music like that, soul music, funk. All of them have something in the bass line that repeats over and over. Just a musical idea that simply repeats without change. That repetitive bass line that just repeats the identical note patterns over and over again is called a ground bass. This is when it was first developed, and it was used in particular settings in opera and oratorio. It was used mostly in laments, in sad songs, because they were trying to portray the sense of tears running down a face, or the sadness of feeling the grief that weighs a person down. So most ground basses in the Baroque era move by step downward. And when they repeat, they simply always have this progression of downward pitches that you hear that help us feel that sense of depression, of leading us down into the darker things that the music wants us to hear. Today, ground basses are used to create all different kinds of emotion, and the most popular ground basses are actually repeated harmonic progressions that make music more upbeat. But we'll talk more about that in the later sections of the class. So what you need to know about the Baroque ground bass is that it was an opera technique for the most part, and that the melody can change, but the bass never does. It always grinds away without fail. The example in Dido and Aeneas that we're going to hear uses a ground bass. And of course that leads us to the actual listening example. This is listening example 5, Dido's Lament from Dido and Aeneas by Henry Purcell. It's from the third act of the opera, near the end, when Dido, the queen, is expressing her sadness and grief before the end of her life. She's lost the man that she loved. She's fooled by the witches, and she knows that she can no longer live because she's so full of grief. This is an aria because it's meditating on this idea of her grief. And it uses a ground bass not only to support the melody, but to create really sad sounds. To give us the sense of the tears falling, the depression. Purcell also uses a lot of dissonance in the melodic line if you compare it to the sound of the ground bass. Again, please use the translation and the listening guide on page 124 and 125. It is in English, but sometimes it's hard to understand sung text if you're not used to listening to that. So, take a look, listen to it, see how the ground bass actually looks so that you can understand how it's working in the music better. Once you've listened to that example, you'll be able to move on to the next chapter folder of content. I hope you've enjoyed learning about the beginnings of opera. We'll revisit opera in the classical and romantic periods as well as in the modern period because it does transform and then continue on into the film music genres that we'll talk about later in the semester. Listen to the example and then move on to the next material.